So just looking at this study here, high red meat intake and all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortality. Is your risk modified by fruit and vegetable intake? So the study population included 74,645 Swedish men and women. And if we look at the conclusion, high intakes of red meat were associated with a higher risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. The increased risks were consistently observed in participants with low, medium and high fruit and vegetable consumption. So we're just looking at this study, meat intake and mortality, a prospective study of over 500,000 people. Context: high intakes of red or processed meat may increase risk of mortality. Objective: determine the relations of red, white and processed meat intakes to risk for total and cause-specific mortality. So the main outcome measure was for total mortality, deaths due to cancer, cardiovascular disease, accidents and other causes. So the conclusion: red meat and processed meat intakes were associated with modest increases in total mortality, cancer mortality and cardiovascular disease mortality. Another study, animal and plant protein intake and all-cause and cause-specific mortality, results from two prospective US cohort studies. Abstract importance: defining what represents a macronutritionally balanced diet remains an open question and a high priority in nutrition research. Although the amount of protein may have specific effects from a broader dietary perspective, the choice of protein sources will inevitably influence other components of diet and may be a critical determinant for the health outcomes. Setting: health professionals in the United States. Participants: 85,013 women, 46,329 men from the Nurses Health Study 1980 to 2012 and the Health Professionals Follow-up Study 1986 to 2012. So they've got a large number of people and over a long period of time. So we've actually got one study is 32 years and the other study is 16 years with 85,000 and 46,000 people. So they're very big studies. So the conclusions and relevance: higher animal protein intake was positively, whereas plant protein was inversely associated with mortality, especially among individuals with at least one lifestyle risk factor. Substitution of plant protein for animal protein, especially from processed red meat, was associated with lower mortality, suggesting the importance of the protein source. So high red meat intake and all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortality. Is the risk modified by fruit and vegetable intake? So the background: a high red meat consumption is associated with a shorter survival and higher risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer and all-cause mortality. Fruit and vegetable consumption is associated with a longer survival and lower mortality risk. Whether high fruit and vegetable consumption can counterbalance the negative impact of a high red meat consumption is unknown. We evaluated two large prospective cohorts of Swedish men and women to determine whether the association between red meat consumption and the risk of all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer-specific mortality differs across amounts of fruit and vegetable intake. The study population included 74,645 Swedish men and women. So the conclusion: high intakes of red meat were associated with a higher risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. The increased risks were consistently observed in participants with low, medium and high fruit consumption. Low carbohydrate diets and all-cause mortality, a systematic review and meta-analysis of observational studies. Objective: low carbohydrate diets and their combination with high protein diets have been gaining widespread popularity to control weight. In addition to weight loss, they may have favorable short-term effects on the risk factors of cardiovascular disease. Our objective was to elucidate their long-term effects on mortality and CVD incidence. So they included 17 studies for a systematic review, followed by a meta-analysis using pertinent data. The conclusion: low carbohydrate diets were associated with a significantly higher risk of all-cause mortality, and they were not significantly associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality and incidence. However, this analysis is based on limited observational studies, and large-scale trials on the complex interactions between LCD diets and long-term outcomes are needed. So if the outcomes of the previous study leave you a little bit confused, we can have a look at this study: low carbohydrate diets and all-cause and cause-specific mortality, 2 cohort studies. Data on the long-term association between LCD diets and mortality are sparse. Objective: to observe the association of a low carbohydrate diet with mortality during 26 years of follow-up in women and 20 years in men. The setting: Nurses' Health Study and Health Professional Follow-Up Study. Participants: 85,168 women, 44,548 men, without heart disease, cancer or diabetes. Conclusion: a low carbohydrate diet based on animal sources was associated with a higher all-cause mortality in both men and women, whereas a vegetable-based low carbohydrate diet was associated with a lower all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. So you can see there is a difference in where the carbohydrates are coming from in comparison to, say, a low carbohydrate diet based on animal sources and a vegetable-based low carbohydrate diet where you haven't got animal sources, for the protein, because obviously there's no carbohydrates in animal sources. And from this study, a low carbohydrate diet from plant or animal sources and mortality among myocardial infarction survivors. The healthiest diet pattern for a myocardial infarction survivors is not known. Specific long-term benefits of low carbohydrate diets are unknown, whether from animal or vegetable sources. There is a need to examine the association between post-MI adherence to an LCD diet and all-cause cardiovascular mortality. We included 2,258 women from the Nurses' Health Study and 1,840 men from the Health Professional Follow-Up Study who had survived a first myocardial infarction during follow-up. The conclusion: greater adherence to a low carbohydrate diet high in animal sources of fat and protein was associated with higher all-cause and cardiovascular mortality post-MI. We did not find a health benefit from greater adherence to a low carbohydrate diet after a myocardial infarction event. So if you're on a high protein animal based diet, you might want to rethink that and look into a whole food plant based diet. And remember, if you don't look after your health now, it won't look after you later. See you in the next video.